Hi everybody, my name is Jens Larsen. One of the questions I get asked most often is, what do I play over a diminished chord? And the diminished chords can be kind of tricky to figure out when you're soloing over a jazz standard. But if you think of it as being just a chord with a lot of tension that needs to resolve and focus more on how you resolve it than what you actually play on it, then it's not that difficult. And that's what I'm going to go over in this video. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, improvising over changes, chordal harmony and triad pairs, then subscribe to my channel. If you want to make sure not to miss anything, then press the little bell notification icon next to the subscribe button. Let's first look at the different progressions where we come across diminished chords. So a diminished chord always wants to resolve, so that means there's not a tonic chord. And it's either going to be a dominant or it's going to be a subdominant chord. If we first look at the version where it's a dominant chord, that could be something like this, where we have a G sharp diminished resolving up to an A minor chord. And really what is happening here is that could just as easily have been an E7 flat 9. If I just put the E in the bass, and that was resolving to an A minor. So in that way this is a dominant diminished, and the diminished is really there instead of a dominant chord. Another one would be if we have a similar diminished, so this F diminished or B diminished in inversion, resolving to an F major 7. And this is a subdominant chord. It's like a sharp 4 diminished, because in the key of F it's like an inversion of a B diminished, and it's resolving to the tonic. And the different variation on this would also be, again, an inversion of the sharp 4 diminished, so we could have the A flat diminished resolving down to a G minor chord, which is also quite common. You have a progression like A minor, A flat diminished, G minor, C7 and F, which is a very common progression in jazz standards. Of these three diminished chords, I'm sure you don't have too much trouble playing it when it's a dominant chord. So playing a G sharp diminished to A minor could be something like, and that's kind of easy because we know where everything is going. You're really used to playing a 5-1 anyway, and you know how to resolve the different notes of the diminished arpeggio here to the 1 chord. It gets much more difficult when it's a subdominant chord. But what I'm going to show you is that if you take some target notes out of the case where we're using the dominant diminished, then it's actually not as difficult to make up the lines. The two examples where the diminished chord is functioning as a subdominant chord are both in the key of F major. So just to figure out what scale to use, if we take the F major scale, that would be this. And we need to have a scale that fits in this key and then also contains these notes. So for the diminished chord we kind of need to have a G sharp in there and we need a B in there. But that's not so difficult to figure out, because if we take the G and make that into a G sharp and the B flat and make that into a B, then we get this scale. And you might recognize that as being A minor harmonic. Since it's kind of easy to play lines with this diminished chord that resolve to A minor, so resolving to an A or resolving to a C, we can try and use those target notes and then resolve to one of the other chords, and that way it's kind of easier to just have something to aim for when we're making lines. That means that we need to sort of look at how do we use those target notes when we're playing towards an F major 7 or a G minor 7. So if we take this diminished chord and then go, then it's easy for an F major 7 to just target the A, so that's not going to be that difficult. And actually you can do the same with the G minor. But what you get here is that you're then targeting the 9 of the chord, and you might want to get used to that sound a bit, but it is easy to play towards it. And in the same way, the C is a chord note in F major, so that's really easy to play towards. Also probably because an F major 7 is actually an A minor triad with an F in the bass. And for the G minor, we get this sound. To give you an impression of how this sounds and how it works, I made two examples that resolve to the major 7 and two other examples where it's resolving to the minor 7 chord, so you have an idea about how I make lines on it and how you can construct your own. After that, I'm going to give you some tips on how you can practice this so that you get it into your ears and into your own playing. In the first example where I'm resolving to the major 7, I'm starting on the E, which is of course also, if you're thinking of it as an E7, it's just the root of the chord. And from here I'm going down to the D, and then I'm running up and down the arpeggio really. And then resolve that to the C, which is of course the fifth in F major 7. The second line resolving to F major 7 starts on the B and then runs up the diminished arpeggio. From here it's a scale run, so from D to E to F, and then just using the G sharp on the B to encircle the A that I resolve to, which is of course the third of F major 7. Probably the most difficult variation is when you have the diminished chord resolving down to a minor 7 chord. So in the key of F you will come across that in this type of progression, so A minor, A flat diminished, G minor 7, and then C7 to F. And that's what I'm going to use for the examples where it's resolving to the minor 7 chord. In this line I start off with just the A minor triad, and then I go into the diminished chord. I start on the B and then up the diminished chord. It's really just a diminished arpeggio. And then I'm pointing towards the A, so the 9th of G minor. And then from here I'm running down the B flat major 7 arpeggio, which is the arpeggio from the 3rd. And then the flat 9 on the C. And then down to the 7, resolving to the 5th of F. In this example I start with a scale run on the A minor, so I actually just start on the A, run up the scale to the C, and I'm using that to just encircle the 3rd of the A flat diminished. Here I'm just running down the arpeggio, and I'm resolving that to the C on the G minor 7, further down to the B flat, and then skipping up to the F, and then using the F and the D to encircle the E on the C7. And then I'm using the flat 9 to run down the scale to B flat, and then resolve that to the A, which is of course the 3rd of F major 7. The easiest way to get used to this sound when you have the A flat diminished resolving down to a G minor 7 is probably to play some lines, and then once they resolve, so you're resolving to the target notes, which is an A or a C, then you really put the chord under there so that you can hear how that note really sits in that sound of the chord. So that could be something like this. So here I'm just playing a diminished line, using also the E, but for the rest just the arpeggio. And then resolving that to the A, and then adding the rest of the chord under it, just to get used to the sound. And of course you can always later go to sort of make it into a complete progression. And the same goes when you're resolving to the 11, so to the C. That could be something like this. And then from there you can of course take the line on. If this is the first time you see one of my videos and you want to learn more about jazz guitar, about improvising, scale choices, arpeggios and stuff like that, then subscribe to my channel. I publish a new lesson every Thursday, and I've been doing this for quite some time, so there's already really a lot of stuff available on my channel. If you want to help me keep making all these videos, then check out my Patreon page. I'm very grateful for that small community of people that are supporting me on Patreon and helping me finding the time and the money to keep making all these videos. That's about it for this week. Thank you for watching, and until next week.